Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Seepersod coming to you from the campus of Binghamton University. Very excited to have you with us today. It's a little bit late to wish you a happy new year as we're almost through to the end of January, but I certainly can welcome you to our very first webinar for the year 2024. Very excited to have you with us for today. And our program is a trustworthy and ethical AI experience. This is a webinar that's part of the Binghamton Learning Network webinar series, which itself is part of our many lifelong learning programs that we have to offer you here at the Alumni Association. As I always do to start out the webinar, I put up our website address at the bottom of the screen, binghamton.edu/alumni. It's a great way to see all that we have going on. We have a movie club, we have a travel program, we have a book club, and we also have launched a podcast series recently. So lots of great stuff for you to check out there, as well as in-person and virtual events, volunteer opportunities, all sorts of ways that you can engage with us here at the university. Binghamton.edu/alumni. Check us out, check that out. After the show, of course, we want you to pay attention to all the great content that we have over the next hour. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we introduce our featured speaker for today. We are happy to take your questions, and we want this session to be as interactive as possible. So you can send me questions from time to time. I'll put up my email at the bottom of the screen in a graphic just like this one. If you're watching us on Facebook, type in your question as a comment. If you're watching on the microsite, add your questions as a comment there, and we will mix these in during the show rather than saving them for the end. We want to get these in as soon as possible. So think of some great questions, send them in, start now. No need to wait at all. So at this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our featured speaker for today, a member of the class of 1999 and also a member of our Alumni Association Board of Directors. Say hello to Stacy Newman Kandel from the class of 1999. She comes to us from the Columbus, Ohio area today and works in user design experience for JPMorgan Chase and has a great deal of experience in that realm and is very passionate about AI. Has a lot of great content for all of us today. So Stacy, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with everybody, and I'm excited to talk about AI today, which is, I know, a very big topic, and talk about it from a little bit of a different angle. So today what I wanted to talk about, and this is going to be kind of an open dialogue, so when Steve said to feel free to throw in any questions or thoughts, I'm more than happy to talk about it, and if it's something that I don't know, I'm transparent and I will tell you I don't know it, but I can get back to you and I can respond to Steve to put out an answer for later on. So why don't we jump to the next slide, please? So just to introduce myself a little bit further, and as we're talking about AI and trust, it's like, okay, who am I and why should you trust me to, about any of the information you're about to hear? So I now am a data architect at JPMorgan Chase. I'm based out of Columbus, Ohio, and I manage a team of data scientists, data engineers, and ML ops. I've been with JPMorgan for over 5 years now and have worked in the technology industry for getting close to 25 years. I, as Steve said, hold a BA in studio art from Binghamton and an MS in human-computer interaction from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. In my time at JPMorgan, I've filed 8 patents and have become a prolific inventor here at the bank. I've also been a guest lecturer and speaker at many conferences and podcasts and live webinars on topics such as user experience, innovation, and ethical AI as well. I've done experience design and technology and solution architecture for several companies and organizations, including American Express, IBM, and NASA. And like I said, I work in Columbus, Ohio, but I reside in Easton, Pennsylvania. It's a very long 7-hour commute. And in Pennsylvania, I have my 3 children, my daughter Tilly, who's 10, my son Murray, who's 7, and my son Harry, who's 4. And like Steve mentioned, I'm a member of the Binghamton Alumni Association Board of Directors. All right, so hopefully this gives you a little bit more about me. So why? Like, what do we really want to explore today in this conversation? We want to explore really how we can openly accept, trust, and integrate AI and ML, so artificial intelligence, machine learning capabilities without rejection or fear. So we ultimately want to understand how transparency and ethics is really relevant to our experiences. And ultimately, we want to increase the transparency in technology enablement to set the stage. We want to make sure that as technology comes forward, and we hear about AI all the time, we hear about it in our jobs and our daily lives. We hear about it from our families and from our friends. And so we want to make sure that it is not something that you fear and reject, but instead can understand it and openly adopt and accept it. So I'm here to tell you it is not like the Terminator. So we are all good right now, but we'll go into some more detail. If we go to the next slide, please. So here's just an overall about our agenda or what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to go through a couple of different questions and we'll have some conversation. I know that we can't have direct interaction, but feel free to, like I said, send a comment or an email to Steve, and I'm happy to address it or even come back to it. There's no reason to, wait till the end with any of this. And then ultimately, I want to also talk about go into some detail and some understanding. So we're all on the same page as to what is reality versus what is, imagination, or ultimately what we've heard that's not maybe true to say. And then ultimately, we'll go through any additional questions and thoughts at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. So question one, so have you out there used artificial intelligence, maybe at work, maybe at home, maybe on vacation, maybe somewhere else, maybe in school? Your answer, and jot this down, if you have a piece of paper and a pencil or pen. And yes, so I'd be curious, what have you done with AI tools today in one of these areas? No, if you haven't used any artificial intelligence, what's holding you back from using AI? Is it something such as, are you being held back based on that you don't have access, or are you held back because you have concerns about it? I'd like to understand. And possibly, so there's not just a yes or no, what you might have done with AI tools. So you might have interacted, but you're not sure if you have completely. That's completely acceptable as well. Hello, Steve.
Hello, I had to jump in on this one when I saw have you used it at work because it just made me think of a kind of a funny story that I thought maybe you and the listeners would enjoy. It's a quick story. So, um, a while back, I wrote an alumni profile about someone as I normally would for the newsletter or the magazine. And I said, let's see what AI would do with this. And I plugged in some of the basic information about the person to see what kind of a story would spit out to see, let's put the human Steve versus the AI Steve next to each other and compare their work. And I can tell you, and it's not just a commercial or a testimonial for me as the content creator, the human work was definitely much better.
Thank you, Steve. So we're going to go into actually what Steve just gave a really nice foreshadow of what we're going to actually talk about today. So that's great. If anybody wants to share anything right now about why they have or they haven't, or possibly maybe, we would love to hear that. There's so many different facets that are possibly out there. Maybe they're already integrated and you haven't even known, or maybe you're seeking them out as well. And any one of these answers is completely acceptable. And we're all in different areas of knowledge about artificial intelligence. And ultimately, we want to grow that understanding. So as more and more becomes available or integrated, you really feel comfortable with its presence and what it's going to do to hopefully help you in your day to day. I'll pause for a second to see if anybody wants to just comment in on any of this. And if not, then I will move forward.
Actually, I have one comment that just came in. Timing is absolutely perfect. My Marcom agency has dabbled with ChatGPT to kickstart copy and design ideation.
That is fantastic. And I've seen it a lot within marketing and communications where individuals are relying on a large language model, which we'll talk about as well, to start them with a lot of content where they're fed specific attributes, and then GPT puts something together that ultimately would be able to help kickstart a strategy, an idea, or something thereof. So ultimately, it's taking some of that rough of I'm starting with a blank piece of paper off the table and getting us going right away. So yes, that is absolutely something that is being used out there, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of that in today's discussion as well. I'll just pause for one more moment to see if anybody else has any questions, comments, thoughts. Okay. If not, we can always come back, but why don't we jump to the next slide, please? So, what is our AI North Star ultimately? Where are we all driving towards? We hear it in the news, we hear it in our everyday lives, and artificial intelligence is really a machine's ability to perform cognitive functions we usually associate with human minds. And that's from McKinsey. And that's ultimately what the North Star is. But what I'm about to tell you is we're not there. So ultimately, this is where we want to get to. But today, our smartest large language models that are out there have about an intelligence density of about a fourth grader, which is my daughter Tilly. And so, Tilly might be great at some things. She is great at some things, but would I rely on her to do everything? Probably not, as even though she thinks she knows everything, she's only in fourth grade. So ultimately, we are not at that point where it's thinking for us or it's being able to do some kind of cognitive behaviors. It's still in its infancy at best. And ultimately, that is the highest intelligence density. A lot of the models aren't even at that level yet as well. If we go to the next slide, please. So I want to actually align our language because I'm talking about LLMs, I'm talking about AI, I'm talking about machine learning, and you probably hear a lot of these terminology thrown out. GPT, you probably hear, and maybe you hear Palm or Prometheus or Llama 2. There's so many different terms. So I want to actually give us all a baseline understanding. So we all have the same language as we're talking today. And hopefully you can use this moving forward as well. So as you can see, the AI is all the way to the right. We're not there yet. We're not at that point, like I just mentioned. But let's start with machine learning, which is ML. And machine learning is a branch of artificial intelligence and computer science, which ultimately focuses on the use of data and algorithms to look at and imitate how humans learn, gradually improving with its accuracy. So it's ultimately learning, but ultimately that's starting from where we have to train and then go from there. A large language model, which is an LLM, is really the deep learning that takes place. So a system such as GPT 3, 3.5, 4, Llama 2, Palm, Prometheus, there's so many out there. Huggy Face has several, but it ultimately is doing that deep learning so that they can recognize, summarize, translate, predict, and generate content using very large data sets. So it's ultimately looking across everything that it's been trained on and ultimately looking then to provide said result based on said input. That is the actual model itself. And so the last one is artificial intelligence, which is ultimately leveraging the computers and machines to mimic problem solving and decision making capabilities of a human mind. Again, we are not at that stage more than maybe a fourth grade level. So why don't we continue to talk about this? Let's dive in a little bit deeper. If we go to the next slide. So what can an LLM, and a large language model, do? So we asked a large language model, what can you do? So it can easily answer questions. It can provide factual, answers to factual questions. It can explain concepts and offer information on a wide range of topics based on what it was trained on. It ultimately, you'll see sometimes if any of you play around with one of, like, maybe Copilot or something else on your own device, phone, tablet, or computer, you might ask it something and then it'll say, well, this is only within the range of what I have been trained on. A lot of times you'll get those responses because it's not all knowing, but it can give you accuracy based on what information it does have. It can generate text, which we just talked about as feedback, as there's a team doing some innovation and ideation for content using it. It generates text, and you can tell it the tone. You can ultimately give it the different pointers of what you need within there. It can write essays. It can write emails. It could do code snippets, and even predictive code snippets. It can write stories, and ultimately it can do a whole lot more. It can also do things from a UI perspective. It can generate imagery for us as well. From a sentiment analysis, it can really look at and analyze the sentiment of a given text. It could look at things like microaggressions, meaning, is it positive? Is there frustration? Is there something negative? Or is this really neutral in ultimately what you're feeding it to, provide some input into? From a conversational agent, it can engage in text-based conversations, providing responses and maintaining context over multiple interactions. So sometimes people go out and they want to talk to Shakespeare or Mark Twain or the president of the United States. And so AI and LLMs can actually mimic that. And you can have a full-on dialogue with any of these people, and really they do a really good job of stepping into those shoes. From data analysis, it can assist with data analysis and tasks, including, manipulating the data, some basic statistical analysis and data extraction. And it can kind of, give it to you in an easy then format for you to then be able to take on for what you need to do next. And research assistance. It can actually help with research tasks by providing information and summaries related to a specific topic or need. Let's go to the next page, please.
Just wanted to jump in with a comment, a question,
Sure.
and I'll just advance the slide before I forget
Sure.
to do that. So we got a comment from Barry sent by email. He says, Chat GPT wrote a lovely poem for my wife, which is a kind of a cool story. And just say, well, Valentine's Day is 2 weeks from tomorrow. So
That is
if
true.
somebody is not so creatively inclined, there appears
You
to
could
be a
have a
good solution for
masterpiece.
that.
You
Yes.
can even have it write it. Yeah, you can even have it right. That's awesome. So thank you for sharing that. That is awesome, because ultimately, like for an anniversary, birthday, any kind of a occasion or no occasion at all, you can actually have a large language model write a poem or a short story for you. And you can actually tell it to even write it in. If you loved how, let's say, like Mark Twain wrote his books, you could actually have it write it based on how Mark Twain would write a book. So you can actually even put it based on who you really admire and how their creativity style. An LLM can actually do that for you. So way to go. Awesome. I hope everybody has super original, creative sentiments moving forward to your family, friends, and peers based on compliments of a large language model. So thank you.
And just as you, I'm
So
sorry, as you got to talking about writing stories and doing research, maybe this is something you'll come to a little bit later, but I'm just kind of curious of, how concerned should we be about students dipping into this a little bit too much as they try to get their homework done or college admission essays and things
I
like that. And I mean, as a teacher, and I've seen this where, somebody's trying to take an advantage and doing something they shouldn't do. It's actually kind of obvious sometimes when somebody hasn't been able to consistently produce a certain level of work and now they're turning in something that's a little too good, raises up all sorts of flags when that happens.
Absolutely. I still think, and Steve, it's great insights as well. I think that there's a lot of things, like we said, that a large language model can do really well, but I think that there's still a lot of checkpoints and things that are really required from a human point of view to be able to fully make sure that what you're doing is really um, accurate, representational of you, and original from your perspective as well, depending on what that is. So we can talk a little bit about it. I know, with college, essays, there was always a problem with looking for plagiarism. And now it's like, okay, well, with a large language model, like everything can look unique. But ultimately, we could talk a little bit about what that means and how we can root out what that means for things like detecting things that were not written or original from said human as well.
Just want to jump in with one more question, if I could, before we
Sure.
go to the next thing.
Yeah.
I've seen photos generated by AI in a comparison with actual photos. I was amazed that I couldn't decide which photos were real and which ones were AI generated. I've also read documents generated by AI, and again, it seemed like it was written by a person. How can an informed electorate citizen protect itself from being manipulated by false AI narratives, videos, and photos? What protections need to be legislated? Very deep question there.
No, that's a fantastic question, and it's right on par with what we're gonna talk about. We're gonna go through some transparency and ethics on this and come and really talk about an ethical checklist as well. So ultimately, you have more transparency and knowledge to be able to look at a piece of writing or an image, because like Midjourney, Dolly, Copilot, they all do images, or even Adobe Sensei, which is a combination of OpenAI and Fluenty 5, two different LLMs combined. And ultimately, how do I know that it's real? Or how do I know somebody's not doing a deep fake? And which I've been asked before as well about deep fakes, and how do we detect that with artificial intelligence? So there's some ways that we can use. We're going to talk through them today, but that's a great question, and that's where I hope that we can ultimately all be thinking on those lines. So ultimately, what can't a large language model do today? So we conducted a semantic search, and so math. So there are, with the caveat, I will put it out there. OpenAI has made some significant improvements in the realm of math in the recent months, but ultimately there's a lot of discussion out there as to what that means and what that does, and it's still being vetted in the open community. You won't see it actually baked in yet into any particular models itself. But they don't really understand the rules of mathematics in general, other than, to be able to potentially combine and do primary, really basic information off of it. So if you're trying to derive a complex algorithm, or trying to graph the data from XY points or whatnot, it doesn't understand to be able to do that today. Reasoning. This is one of the huge ones. They perform, a large language model performs well on common sense reasoning, but they are very poor, or very, it's in its infancy at tasks requiring deeper reasoning skills. So ultimately, it could probably do a common sense of like, yes, you spill a cup of water on the floor, so you should get a paper towel to clean it up. That is common sense, right? It's going to rain out. You should bring an umbrella, things of that nature. But ultimately, thinking about, and deeper, learning of where, what I should be working on, from ultimately next steps within my work, or ultimately how to do innovation at a deeper level, or ultimately how do I determine between 3 different solutions that are offered to me and why one versus the other. Um, those type of reasoning skills are not baked in. And like I said before, the intelligence density today, how human-like is it in its thinking? At best, it's a fourth grader, and that's in still very few of the LLMs out there today. OpenAI, which is ChatGPT, does have a higher intelligence density, but it's also, they do make a free model, but it's not as extensive as ultimately the paid for. So it is really it's a private LLM. A lot of the open ones are a little bit behind, but ultimately will make strides in catching it as well. From a planning perspective, we've seen that it's particularly not great with anything that would be considered planning tasks, such as generation or ultimately reuse or replanning. So things to do with ultimately maybe your everyday life, potentially with work or program management. It's not really good at understanding something or how it conflicts or why, and ultimately suggesting or updating based on specific factors. That again requires human thought to be put into it. Describing how they solve the problems. This is a significant limitation of large language models. They cannot describe how they arrive at a solution, and ultimately, that can cause problems, because ultimately, if something happens and we took this, whatever the direction was of this large language model or its output, it could have significant impacts. And ultimately, different than deepfake, if I'm relying and trusting on what it's telling me and something negative comes as an outcome from it, I want to understand why it arrived at that. But the LLMs really can't explain how they're arriving at it, other than that they're looking across whatever their data set is. Contextual understanding, again, they really lack context for the data they use to make decisions and posing problems for decision making in the real world. So again, you really need to be able to have cognitive thought process to be able to do this, because today our systems are not advanced enough to be able to do that. They have a limited set of data that they are trained on, and while it could be a large, vast ocean of data, it is still limited and not accounting for any any and all possibilities or edge cases or whatnot. So take it with a grain of salt is what I have to say.
As I look at what's on the slide here, I think about online shopping. It doesn't really matter what the product is. Let's just say, for example, like a pair of sneakers,
Mhm.
and you get that automated chat thing that pops up like, "Hi, Steve, do you need assistance with blah, blah, blah?" And it seems like it really can't reason properly. And I just wonder if it's more of a case of it's just never really going to be able to do this because of what LLM can't do, or it's just because the prompts being fed into it are just not sufficient. So it's like garbage in, garbage out.
Oh my gosh. I could be on a soapbox about virtual assistants for hours and hours and what they can and cannot do. Um, Today, there's a lot of limitations with a lot of virtual assistants. It's a really small subset of what they have capability for. And typically you'll see with them, can I help you with an issue? And if you say yes, then it'll give you a set of items that it could then help you with. But if it's outside the scope of what it's taking you down, where it gives you the selections of A, B, C, D, E, then ultimately you are unfortunately out of luck with the virtual agents today. I think with generative AI, which is ultimately fine tuning and tweaking as we go, and inclusion of like things like microaggressions, they will get better and better at really being more personalized towards what a user is doing, whether it be shopping, planning a vacation, or ultimately looking for help on something. As we get better with our intelligence density, as we get better with what we're training it on, and ultimately from a generative perspective, hopefully they will be more helpful in the future. But today it's typically on a very limited set of information and scope. Let's go to the next slide. So humans within loops, and ultimately users like me, Steve, everybody who's on this call today, we need controls and ethics built into processes and digital products, or there's failures of technology, and ultimately those failures end up getting blamed on us. So if I'm relying, let's say, on a system, GPT, Llama 2, Prometheus, Falcon, and it gives me something that's not accurate, I potentially, the impact is I am giving information that is not actually accurate and not holistically fully fact check and the source of truth. So then I would be blamed as the individual who gave that information, not the actual system. So when we talk about it, from a general population of humans, are frustrated by applications on our phone or our different devices or websites, but in turn we seem to place a large amount of trust in technology to protect humans, us, from unintended misuse and risk. And I think that this is a really big issue, and ultimately we are placing a lot of responsibility on you to be able to know right from wrong. And again, those concerns about how do I know, and is this, real, or is this not real, or is this information accurate or not accurate? These are serious things that I don't think necessarily people always question. They take it for granted that what they are asking, they're getting a factual answer. It's very different information than if you go and you're asking something specific to Wikipedia or you're Google searching something. Unfortunately, it really depends on each language model and ultimately what its set has been trained on, and then you as the user knowing if there's something wrong, which is a significant responsibility. And ultimately, the longer the disclaimers or acknowledgement statements are, the higher propensity it is to not take the time to read it. So I work with a team of data scientists here at my job, and we are looking at employees. We're looking at internally how to make our experience better here for our employees. But you probably also think about information from different aspects, right? So who has your information and what are they doing with it? And if you really think about it from your phone, let's say you want a new app on your phone, you will probably scroll, accept, acknowledge, accept, because you want to get that downloaded so you can start using it. You don't really read that, that pages and pages of that fine, 6-point text. That's all of the information and disclaimers on what could be or not be accurate, or ultimately where liability lies. And we might take more time in certain instances where we're more uncomfortable with where information is, to hit, to accept it. But ultimately, and as from a bigger perspective, we're all guilty of going through and scrolling and just hitting accept to move on and not really understanding the risks. Again, people don't necessarily take the time to understand output. So they're putting in something that they want information or an answer to, but they're not really gut checking if it's really accurate, or if there's something that looks unusual about it. especially if it's time sensitive. And I know we talked about, was brought up about, the images that AI creates from, all the different AI systems today. And ultimately, if you look at a lot of them, what's really interesting is if you took a good look at what it is in some aspects, you can see where you can tell it, hey, write like Happy New Year 2024 in whatever it is. And it won't exactly give you that potentially in that image. And so something is usually off, or like the image is missing feet, or the cyclist does not necessarily have legs that go down to feet on pedals or whatnot. So you'll see really interesting things take place as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about fairness and bias because that also comes into play. And most people don't go and validate. So if it looks right, we say, all right, it's probably accurate. But again, that's placing a lot of responsibility on you to say that then if something goes wrong, you then become responsible because from your perspective, it looked right, but maybe it wasn't. So ultimately, it's always good to, like I said, take it with a grain of salt, depending on what you're doing. If it's something that an LLM is really good at today, like we talked about, then go ahead. Like it's great at writing poems. It's great at writing stories. It's great at impersonation, to talk to somebody. Use it for the means that it is. But if you're looking at something that's potentially outside the scope of those, you really need to be responsible and ultimately, as of today, really gut check, fact check it. And ultimately, our laws on information and data and accuracy, with usage of artificial intelligence and from a liability perspective are in what we would say like the dark ages next to where we're at. And the law typically lags where technology is headed or is at. And so ultimately, this is why it's so important to have this conversation about transparency and ethics within the use of new technology. If we, oh, hi, Steve.
Hello again. So,
Hello.
talking about legal issues is a perfect segue to this question I just got by email. It's a great question. What is the likelihood AI can replace alternative dispute resolution? Mediation is a profession that is heavy in its requirements for compassion, empathy, reading people in distress, and problem solving. Some judicial circuits have embraced a variation of ADR with ODR online dispute resolution. ODR does not adhere to the strict ethical guidelines of confidentiality that ADR has. That's a tough one.
So that is a great question. Thank you for whoever out there wrote that. So it plays into so many different things, right? So it plays into microaggressions. If somebody, if it's not a human, is it really picking up on my frustration or my anxiety or my anger or my happiness? Is it, if it's not, what is it? There's no privacy. What does that mean about my data? What's happening? What's transpiring from that perspective? And also, does it really have the ability to cognitively be able to decision like a human, depending on the circumstance? Because each case might be different and individual, and ultimately being able to recognize that and navigate from that particular circumstance. So again, I think that it potentially could give a recommendation, but it shouldn't be the only thing that's used. It should really be used in conjunction with humans as well to be able to take it as a method of input, but not the holistic solution. It would be it's the same as I open a service ticket at my job for something to do with my computer, and it automatically closes my case and sends me a response of read these 3 articles to do it. And I'm like, these 3 articles won't help me. I don't sit on a Windows machine. I'm on a MacBook. So again, it closed my request and said it did its job, but it didn't do its job because I now need to open another request because I need a different answer. So again, having that human intervention is absolutely required. That's a great question. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the ethics baked into that. And when you talked about privacy and legal, that's a great segue into this. So we should be using guidelines and moral principles in applying artificial intelligence in order to make sure that we can trust and adopt these new tools and technology. You need to really take your expertise in a given field or topic and really be able to apply it to the tools that are coming in, so that way you can make sure that it's right. It would be similar to like my fourth grader doing her homework. I'm not going to just be like, she's right. I am going to intervene and review to make sure that she's not just deriving an answer, but she understands how she got there too. Again, so it requires human interaction. Um, from an ethical perspective, we want to make sure that there's clear standards and communication to remove any negative implications. So you really want to make sure that it is very clear what it's doing, what the outcomes or output is, and why. Fairness and bias are a huge area to really consider today. So from a diversity, equity, and inclusion, LLMs don't necessarily take all of that into account. I've seen it both in how it writes and ultimately how it derives imagery as well. Again, with that said, you don't want to have anybody who then is harmed from the output of artificial intelligence. So you really need to look at it from a bias and fairness perspective. Is it inclusive? Is it ensuring from an accessibility perspective that, you know, all can be able to utilize said outcome? I think that if you look at some of these things or you look at what it's giving, it's based on, again, that set of data that it's been trained on. And ultimately, the algorithm or the data might not have the diverse amount of detail that is required and potentially does not have enough information to be able to be fair in what it's doing. So you need to really be able to account for that, which is where you come in as the expert and are there to, again, take it from a starting point and then ultimately help to then, get it to where it needs to be. You want to foster trust. So ultimately, you want to make sure that, as we hear, about different things that happen in different industries across the globe, there's things that people hear that are about, well, we trusted and X, Y, and Z happened. So what we want to do is we want to ensure that the information we're receiving is also from sources that we also trust and ultimately can acknowledge that as well. We want to reduce risk of reputational, regulatory, and legal exposure by having ethical guidelines baked in, because these can lead to costly fines and ultimately down the road probably and even like jail time, prison sentence. So we ultimately don't want to harm. Our purpose is to help better our human population with the use of AI. And we want to consider, communicate and user feedback to positive interactions. So we want to make sure that we are having, a positive reaction based on that what's been inputted is actually accurate and the training sets are updated and you have this information readily available. So you ultimately have that foundational baseline to know what you're working with. And ensuring, experiences are clear and transparent and trustworthy really are the key to being able to really have a good relationship with artificial intelligence. If we move to the next slide, please. So here's what I call our handy ethical checklist. And ultimately, it goes through these 3 different categories, and these can be used with any kind of AI or agent that you might be interacting with today or moving forward. And they don't necessarily need to all be ticked in every section, but you want to make sure that you have a majority of them that you feel comfortable with, because this will help you to gain trust of the said system. So ultimately, the first area is fairness, and ultimately, is the application inclusive of its intended outcomes? So is it really representational of, said population that it's supposed to be giving information or solutions for? Can its actions be perceived as reasonable? If it asks you something that doesn't seem reasonable, or it's all of a sudden talking to you in a manner that you're like, I feel like I'm being scolded by my LLM, my agent. Not a good thing. Does the user, do you understand that they are acting with artificial intelligence? Again, back to that question of, is it a person? Is it a real photo? How do I know that this is ultimately AI, which bakes back into my first question. Is it possible that you've used it and you're not even sure to date? So you want to make sure that people have awareness to when it's a real person versus when it's a machine. And are the outputs from artificial intelligence relevant to the context being set? The next part of this is accountability and responsibility. And so ultimately, it's looking for, are the outcomes from the AI, the agent, are they trustworthy? Or does it ultimately kind of seem like it rubs you the wrong way? There's something off about it. Are the origins of the data and data models associated with the metadata trustworthy? So ultimately, is the data that it has trustworthy? And that's a much harder question to know the answer to as an end user. But ultimately, this is where taking your experience and ultimately applying it will help you to be able to know. And ultimately, if something doesn't seem right in the data, then you need, as a user today of a said technology, need to be responsible and say, I'm not quite sure, so I'm going to go and potentially ask something different, or maybe do another search through another system such as Google, who does searching, to see, because search is very different than an actual LLM. So it's providing different types of information to you. And are the AI's actions considered to be clear and transparent? Or is it giving you something that seems muddled or opaque in its responses? And because it can't really tell you how it derived them, then if you don't trust it, don't take it at its word. Does the AI appear to be responsible for using known and repeatable patterns? So with an agent, is it ultimately giving you the same response every time you go in and ask it? You're getting a similar response. So ultimately, that this is taking you down the right path, or this is giving you the right set of information back. And is there a lot of confidence in, and can it handle an array of use cases? Or is it, when you put in something that would be a special, edge case example, it's giving you something that just doesn't make sense in context? And has is there due diligence? So this is ultimately that gut checking of what is being, done versus face value, and ultimately just scrolling through and accept. Privacy. It's another huge thing. What is going on with my information, and how is it being leveraged and used? So is there a chance for reputational risk that comes out of this? Is it, what it's giving me, going to harm somebody from a reputational perspective? Is there regulatory or legal exposure? So ultimately, could I get in trouble and be on the naughty list, as I say my kids are on the naughty list, for what it's giving me as an answer? And is it sensitive, like personal data, and it's potentially looks like it's not using it in an appropriate means as well? So you want to make sure that before you take forward whatever said interaction is, you kind of go through this as a mental model, and you can feel free to print this and have a handy dandy copy of it. to be able to make sure that, or just in your mind, something doesn't seem right. Everybody here has a good intuition and sense. And so if it's going against the grain, then take a step back and question it. If we go to the next slide, please. So the second question, and I know we're getting towards the end here, but what would you want to use AI for? So you or me as an individual would use AI to help me, because the purpose of AI is to assist us in our day-to-day interactions and life events. And so being a virtual personal assistant, I would love AI to be able to help me, with, like my budgeting and, ultimately, vacations and, alerting me that the sign up for my kids' soccer league is next Tuesday. That would be great. Or hey, there's a discount coming up for the flight that you've been searching for out to California. That would be great. Again, we've said that virtual agents today are kind of limited in what they can do, but moving forward, and this is kind of like an open, what would you want it to do? Because that's going to help drive forward where the technology goes as well. Would you want it to help you by finding things? Help me find information or data. Help me find my phone, because I lose my phone a lot, and my car keys for that matter. Help me find my children. Where would my daughter be at 2 p.m. on, a Tuesday afternoon? She'd probably be in recess at this point. Assisting with repetitive tasks. This is something that AI is very, very good at today. Down the road, maybe it could help through our machines with doing the laundry, being able to do the grocery shopping through devices like, Amazon, and ultimately doing a grocery shop by knowing your fridge, what's in it, what you buy, when things are low or on a given day. It could ultimately do other things, like be able to do something that you would have to do every day. Like, I have to go in and add XYZ to the calendar every time that I sign up for a new swim meet or whatnot, and allowing it to be able to do things like that that will give me meaningful time back in my day to do other things that are meaningful. Or something that, just think about it out of the box. What do you wish that it could help you with? Because it's not potentially out of the question. It could potentially help you. And by putting those thoughts out there is where you help innovation to push forward on a particular area for this technology. If we go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to show a few examples of trustworthy AI in play. And these are all from systems that we have here, but ultimately trustworthy by explanation. This LLM, if you look at it, chat is ultimately guiding a user through the tasks that they are best suited to perform. So ultimately, it's telling you right up front that it is a chat AI. It is not a human, and it can help you with, it's actually defining what it can help you with. So, instead of by the time you've gone down a path and like, oh, this can't help me with something, it's telling you right up front, these are the things that I've been trained on and I can help you with. If we go to the next slide, please. So about communications being transparent, it reminds the user how their data is going to be used and why. So ultimately, it's saying right up front, this is how our our LLM is working, and ultimately the information that you're asking and the data will help the system to learn how to help you better. So it's from a generative perspective. So it's constantly in a learning model, and ultimately then training based off of its learning. But you know exactly what it's doing with that information as well. If you go to the next slide, please. It's easy to understand. So it's ultimately demonstrating how it makes terms of use more meaningful. So it ultimately is showing you what's been copied and, including certain sub facts about it, and ultimately telling you what else you can do. So it's basically giving you information that you can really understand and know how you want to move forward with it before a system just doing it on your behalf. If we go to the next slide, please. And trustworthy via transparency. So this is ultimately demonstrating how citations in line are from an AI model, and they're in line with user conversations. So ultimately, you could see where there's AI interaction versus real human interaction, because the system is making sure that you know the difference between the two. So these are just giving you some examples of where AI can be easier to accept and adopt because it's being transparent in it's telling you what it's doing with its data from an ethical standpoint. So it makes it easier to work with. With an entire 4 minutes left, are there questions, comments, thoughts? I'm happy to answer.
Yes, we're close to 1 o'clock, but not a hard stop from my side or Stacy's. So if you have questions, I'll leave my email address up on the screen. I have a story and a question that came in by email. Uh, so a funny thing happened, and I've started to receive emails, not solicited, not anything I wanted, but I'm getting these recruiting emails with jobs in Marcom, and it's from an AI recruiter.
Mhm.
And it's pulling in these jobs from who knows where. But then at the bottom, it had meet Jenny Johnson, your virtual recruiter.
I've actually gotten this too. So yes, I've
And
seen this as well.
and I about flipped when I saw the picture because the picture looked fairly
Yeah.
similar to my wife. So it was like, it's just kind of creepy about what does the machinery know about me? And it's purposely trying to give me a face that it may be real, it may not, but it's, trying to give me something they think I would like to look at, which I do. But that was really, it's really,
So
really
I've,
weird.
I've actually gotten those same emails sent to me. So I completely know and can relate to that. Ultimately, if you read down in the print, it says that it's a virtual agent. So you know that it's not actually a human, but it led me to bigger questions of how did whoever is this getting my data, and ultimately what are they ultimately, searching for based on what kind of data attributes they have of mine, and who actually gave them this data. So I, because I think about all this and I stop and I gut check, I'm like, so immediately I unsubscribed from it, and ultimately have been referencing and called out, have an open question to the company saying, hey, how do you have my data? Where did you get it from? What data attributes of mine do you have? And ultimately, I am telling you, as the owner of these data attributes, that you are not allowed to have them, and that from a privacy perspective, you need to delete them. So again, things like that, we all need to, really take a step in it and really help out.
Got a couple of questions by email, and then I'll check the comment box as well. But it's really starting to pick up now, which is great. And I think I said before the show, I said we get kind of a late start with these questions, and when they come in, they really start coming in, and that seems to be happening. One question has to deal with higher ed and AI. It'll be helpful to hear the speaker's thoughts on how AI is and can be used on campuses to improve the educational experiences of both students and professors. And secondarily, uh, he's interested in the thoughts on how universities can use AI to improve their ability to reach and acquire new donors. There's quite a lot there.
So there's a lot to unpack in that. So from an AI perspective, to have more meaningful impact and experiences with both staff and students, I would say you want to look at ultimately what type of data a system can source, and ultimately what types of research is out there that's been loaded into the training set for the said LLM. So ultimately, you want to be able to look at research that's been done on student experiences that have been positive, student experiences that have been negative, potentially picking up microaggressions and understanding them. And looking at potentially all different types of factors, and dependent on course of study, year, location, you could you could tweak several different instances. If you have a model that you have trained with those specific data points and have ingested them, you can then use it to say, how can I make things better? But ultimately, as an expert looking at this, and I coming from a user experience background, would say you also want to take that information that will come back and gut check that against research and seeing where there's gaps that need to be filled by doing additional groundwork from a human perspective that can supplement what's being done. But ultimately, it can help you to organize the information. It could help you to potentially pull out where it's seeing really big screaming points. It could help you to potentially, document and move forward for different means of what works well, what doesn't. And ultimately, you can look at then the model over time and continuously to have generative AI where it's continuously tuning and updating, and you can see where the model drifts as well, which ultimately means the model kind of changes on what its outputs are dependent on what the inputs are coming into it, and ultimately what data set and ultimately additional information that's added to it. So I think there's a wide range of things that you can do from an experience perspective, both from your staff and from your student population, and using LLMs to make it a better experience all around. And ultimately, you can also use it from what's the best settings for using it from an experience. Like, is a classroom setting? Is it a lecture hall? Is it remote learning? What would be the best? And based on data inputs, you can ultimately help to derive what would be responsible answers to potentially action moving forward. I would say for the second question about reaching out to additional donors or additional people that you want to broaden your landscape, I think that this is where today some of that questionable behavior comes in, right? Some of the questionable, how did people get my data or how are they using it? And so I would say you could absolutely use LLM to be able to, tap into additional, population for sure, but with the understanding that how you actually, and it could actually write in a stylistic way something that would really resonate with said population or user segment. So you might have it look at different types of population, maybe some that are, they just graduated within the last 10 years, maybe some that have been experienced professionals for a while, maybe some that have retired, and all different segments within there. And you could ultimately have the system write something that would resonate with that said particular user segment to help get them interested. At the same time, you also will need to really make sure that there's awareness that you're either gut checking and then ultimately fine tuning it from a humanized perspective, or what you're going to send out, if you're going to send it out to a mass population, making sure that it is very clear that it is, this is being generated by, a agent, and ultimately allowing the user to have control to unsubscribe for it or to find out more additional information as well. So that communication needs to be really clear so people can trust what they're getting into their inboxes.
This is great. We're getting some questions. We'll take a few more and then we'll neatly wrap it up for this afternoon. One of them is, in marketing and communications, do we need to disclose if we use AI in a given piece? I guess maybe the answer will be depends on how much of the AI you're using.
Well, it depends in general. So I think it's a great starter from a blank piece of paper to actually have something to ideate off of. I think if it's, something that you're using to send out, a daily email or text, I think as long as you put into it somewhere in like your print at the bottom, and again, this is where responsibility comes in, that you're stating that this is from said, said business, with, incorporating the use of said agent AI. So, again, it gives people a means to opt out of it. It gives people transparency in what's being done and an area where they can learn more information about it. I think that it's completely fine to use it. I think it actually is helpful from generating ideas and to ultimately help us to really, push the boundaries forward and ultimately, accomplish more with just saying like, hey, can we throw in this tone or this additional insight into it? And it will literally give you a completely new set of examples within seconds, which is pretty awesome, which would have taken somebody hours or days to do beforehand. I think it's ultimately looking at it from that fairness and looking at it from a bias and a diversity perspective and ensuring that you're transparent with what is going out and it's being checked as well. But I think it's completely legitimate to use.
After this one, we have two more. Do you believe training AI with more diverse data sets will be the sole solution for making facial recognition technology more efficient?
It's a good question. I think that training on more diverse sets will be inherently helpful, but I think that there's still probably more to it. Again, I'm not ultimately an expert in facial recognition technology, but I would think that ultimately having additional diverse sets, which is hugely required across all LLMs today, and it's a huge need that we don't have, will help it to not have a bias and ultimately help it to give a more more range of what its outputs would be. Again, this would need to be checked from a human against what is, and ultimately looking at what it's coming up with and ultimately making sure that, it is ultimately something that can be accepted and used. I'm sorry, I don't have more on it. That's not my area of expertise in facial recognition, but yes, for diversity.
There's a question by email. If asked to assess controversial issues, such as the pandemic, will AI have access to the unconventional perspective now restricted by censorship to alternate platforms like Substack? If not, what good is it? How can integrity be ensured in the market? Is this ready for prime time?
So there's a lot to unpack in there too. I think that today it can only give you outputs based on what its inputs would be. So said topic, if you're asking it something and it took place after the model has not been trained, it can't even provide you any kind of information. Can it provide the source of truth? It depends on what you call the source of truth, right? Because ultimately its source of truth is based on its data set that it has. I think that ultimately, is it ready for prime time? I think LLMs are ready in things such as repeatable tasks. I think it's ready for things like doing some baseline analysis for helping, write stories, help generate poems or ideas or imagery. I think that there's, it can help with predicting what would be a next step for, what code should I write. There's many things that it is in prime time for. I think that ultimately assessing it for controversial issues, it's not ready for prime time yet. I think that there's so many different edge cases and use cases and points of view based on fairness and diversity that models potentially are not trained on that huge data set to be able to do that. And again, like we said, from a reasoning and contextual point of view, that cognitive reasoning that helps us to get to a said outcome, the LLMs are not doing that today. And so ultimately, I would say it's great, to get its point of view from from Barney Rubble or from, or from Mark Zuckerberg as it impersonates it, but ultimately not to take as like its sole word as truth today.
And the last question of the show for today, Can AI help evaluate the true value of a property, preventing fraud?
That is a great question. I think that ultimately, if it's input and trained on the right data points and attributes for a property, knowing what is, what isn't, and being able to also be trained on what is considered the standard, it should inevitably help with that piece of it. Again, you should have a human who has expertise in the property being able to gut check, but if it has all of the attributes put into it and ultimately can then go and check it against real, real data that's out in the fields to ultimately say that this resonates or this is acceptable versus this does not. And it's, within, it's within what would be the said confines of considered okay. And then I think that it's okay to use it. But I think, again, we as humans still need to be part of the process. I wouldn't allow the process to go on its own, but it can give you a recommendation that you can then check based on the different inputs it's giving you.
Stacy, thank you so much. This
Absolutely.
is also fascinating. We could have gone into a 90-minute time slot with this and still been chugging and chugging with these great questions, and
This has been
so
great.
much
Thank
to
you,
unpack
everybody,
here.
for
And
questions. I'm glad everybody's asking questions because that's how we're going to make sure that we are doing this in the right way and that we're able to accept these new technologies in a meaningful way as well.
absolutely, the people are the watchdogs of this piece of technology, and so we want to do it responsibly, do it ethically, and still a work in progress. Not quite there to where
Absolutely.
we want it, but
Absolutely. For sure.
has a lot of promise. But thank you so much for sharing your time and your
Good
expertise
to
with
be
us
here.
today, for the benefit of all of the alumni watching. Certainly
Sure. If
appreciate it.
anybody sends you in any questions afterwards, I'm happy to take them offline with you, and so you can send them.
Sounds good, and feel free. So I will definitely forward these questions along. So if you email me, and I'll put my email up just one more time in case you want to jot it down, send the questions, and then I will pass these along as well. And I know we ran into some bonus time here, so thank you so much. As the audience, you were awesome. You came in strong numbers and really brought the energy today and made for a really fun program. And so want to share for those still watching that we have the next webinar coming up on February 28th. Jaden Nogi from the class of 2020 is going to talk about burn bright, don't burn out. In addition to working in the field of accounting, she's also a certified life coach. And certainly, as we're called upon to do so many things, both personally and professionally, it's hard to make it all work sometimes and feel that we're effective and feel that we're taking care of ourselves. And so that's going to be what this program will talk about in a couple of weeks. So check that out. And I just want to say thank you again for joining us. For Stacy Newman Kandel and everybody else here, I'm Steve Seepersod. Thank you so much. And we will see you on the next webinar on the 28th.